Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Are we ready to get started? You ready?
Yes, we're
Gentlemen.
ready.
All right, let's call this meeting to order. Could I have a binder, notes? All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I want to call to order our regularly scheduled Board of Equalization meeting. Ms. Cicchetti, could you please call the roll?
Chair Cohen,
Present.
Vice Chair Schaefer,
Present.
Mr. Gaines,
Present.
Mr. Vasquez,
Present.
Mr. Applewhite.
Present.
We have a quorum. Thank you. Will you please join me by standing up and placing your right hand over your heart and repeating the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, good morning. I'm so excited. We've got a wonderful day planned for our work group meeting. I first want to just check in with Ms. Cicchetti. Are there any announcements?
No, we just want to make sure that we're announcing that we're opening up the Property Tax Abatement Board Work Group today.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to start with opening remarks. We'll start with Mr. Vasquez.
Good morning, good morning, good morning to the members here, as well as those that made the drive up here and will be showing up in person, and for many of those that are online and will be joining us today. I know in looking at the list of speakers and the talent that we have this morning, or all day today pretty much, there's a lot of very powerful folks in the field of affordable housing, and I know many of them have very tight and busy schedules, so I really appreciate the fact that they're giving up some of their time to join us today. Looking forward to many of the presentations as we look at ways that we could help, hopefully up here on the board, either through tax abatements or property tax, or the possible tax credits that we're looking at for those that are interested in getting involved with the affordable housing demand in this state of California. I want to thank Madam Chair and your staff, and then all the BOE staff for putting this together, because I know just the logistics of this is very difficult and time consuming. And so I just wanted a little shout out and kudos to everybody that helped put this all together. With that, I'll turn it back over to Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from the Executive Director, Ms. Yvette Stowers.
Good morning, Chair Cohen and honorable members. I'd like to first thank the board for their leadership in exploring ways the property tax system could be utilized to incentivize affordable housing in California. This work group on property tax abatement provides a valuable forum for public discussion with taxpayers, stakeholders, and state and local officials on this very complex issue. This is also a great opportunity for anyone to provide input and propose possible solutions and other ways we can work together to spur housing. As the BOE co-administers the welfare exemption, we have a critical role in how we can alleviate the housing crisis. Finally, I also like to thank our esteemed group of presenters for taking time out of their busy schedule to participate today. I am very much looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the opening remarks. Colleagues, I want to officially welcome everyone today to the second Board of Equalization Property Tax Abatement Work Group meeting. Those that are joining online and in person, we are happy to see you and to hear from you today. It's important that we take a moment to acknowledge California's unprecedented housing crisis, which actually requires us to make available 2.5 million additional units of housing by 2030 to close the gap, and $1 million for affordability. We established the work group to explore whether California should consider property tax abatements to incentivize housing developments here in our home state. We held our first meeting with an emphasis on highlighting California's current housing crisis and the challenges in developing market rate, missing middle, as well as affordable housing. We also heard testimony about national as well as California incentives that use property tax abatements to help incentivize and spur housing. Today's focus is going to be a little bit different. We're going to hear from developers, county assessors, who will take some time to address the impacts of property tax abatements in stimulating the housing development. We're also going to hear from mayors and council members as well as chairs of the local board of supervisors. And we have a very distinguished lineup of local electeds that will address whether property tax abatements could make a difference in incentivizing housing. And of course, as I stated last month, we cannot have this discussion without continuing to examine the importance of ensuring equity in development of housing and how to use property tax abatements, how that could possibly be an important tool in advancing equity here in California. I want to take a moment just to acknowledge all the people that put together today's conversation, my staff, my colleagues' staff, as well as the Board of Equalization. We appreciate your time and energy in making this conversation happen. So with that, I'd like to turn the meeting back over to our Commission Secretary, Ms. Cicchetti. Please call the next item.
Good morning. My understanding is we are taking one item out of order. We're going to take up item number 3 first, overview of current property tax incentives in California, and then circle back to item number 2, the color of housing.
Okay.
With that being said, item 3 on the board work group agenda is overview of current property tax incentives in California. The speaker is Mr. David Young, Deputy Director, State Board of Equalization, Property Tax Department.
Good. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Young. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, Chair Cohen, honorable members of the board, and guests. As already mentioned, my name is David Young. I'm the Deputy Director of the Property Tax Department. So just a brief little overview. During the July board meeting, we heard the work group heard testimony from the governor's office and various agencies on California's need for additional housing, especially in the low and the moderate income segments. The work group also heard testimony from developers on incentives they need in order to spur such additional construction. And lastly, the work group heard from housing advocates looking to promote equity in low and moderate income housing, especially for communities of color. So with that, what I will do this morning is I will give you a brief overview of the current property tax incentives for affordable housing. I will start with a review of the constitutional authorities, followed by the statutory provisions, and lastly, I will present a couple of legislative proposals to watch. So, next slide, please. So, Article 13, Section 1 of the California Constitution subjects all property taxation. Section 2 authorizes the legislature to exempt all forms of tangible property, but it does not provide for anything that is real property. So where the sections 3, 4, and 5 provide the constitutional authority to exempt real property. So Section 3 lists specific types of property that are exempt from taxation. They include things like state-owned property, local government-owned property, certain nonprofit cemeteries, and growing crops. Section 4 provides the legislature with the authority to create the disabled veterans exemption and the welfare exemption, which I will cover a little bit more in my presentation. And Section 5 provides the authority to exempt certain buildings under construction, land, and equipment that are under the welfare exemption too. Next slide, please, if we can move on to slide 3. So the welfare exemption, as I mentioned, Article 13, Section 4, the legislature has the constitutional authority to exempt property owned by a qualifying organization, a nonprofit, and used for specific purposes. Those specific purposes are for religious, scientific, and charitable, religious, charitable, and hospital purposes. That was put in 1944 and implemented under Section 214 of the Revenue Taxation Code. And when they actually implemented that, they included one other purpose, and that is the scientific part of it. So in general, the welfare exemption is available for organizations that are formed and operated exclusively for those qualifying for purposes, scientific, hospital, religious, and charitable. And the property must be used exclusively for those purposes also. Both the organization and the property has to be used for those purposes. That exemption is jointly administered by the board and local county assessors. So the board reviews the qualifications of the entity. The local assessors takes a look at the actual property and how it's used. So it's a co-administered program. Next slide, if you can move on to page 4. So 214 actually provides the general welfare exemption. Section A provides broad general provision that if property is used, owned and used for those purposes, religious, hospital, scientific, and charitable, it can be exempt. We move down to 214F. 214F provides a very specific exemption for low-income housing. F exempts property used exclusively for housing for elderly and handicapped or disabled families. 214G is the general one that provides it for low-income housing, and 214G exempts property used exclusively for low-income rental housing. 214G provides the exemption for property used exclusively for low-income rental housing by households meeting prescribed income limits. In some cases, the properties are restricted. In most cases, the property has to be restricted by an agreement or a deed restriction designating the minimum number of units to be rented or to qualified household that meets certain income levels. The qualifying claimant must receive low-income housing tax credits or some form of government financing. Those that do not use tax credits or government financing can fit under this provision also, but their exemption is limited to $20 million in assessed value. And finally, there is 214H. That exempts property use exclusively for emergency or temporary shelters. So 214 provides a general exemption for this type of housing. This is the incentive that we currently have. So will now move on to page 5, if we can be so kind as to move on. Okay. So Revenue Taxation Code 214.15 provides that the holding of real property for by a nonprofit corporation for future construction of affordable housing is a charitable purpose. So basically what this does is that if it is already constructed for low-income housing, for rental low-income housing, it can be exempt under 214. 214.15 provides the exemption for the holding period. So as they acquire the property, before they build it, and during construction, they can also qualify for the welfare exemption. 214.18 does the same thing for property owned by, basically, for community land trust. They had legislation put in that also includes them in that welfare exemption. If we could move to page 6. As I mentioned earlier, the welfare exemption under 214 requires the property be owned by a qualifying nonprofit. In the cases where it is not a qualifying nonprofit that actually owns the real property, Section 236 can also provide an exemption. There is one qualifying issue with that, is that they they must have another qualifying nonprofit basically lease that property. So if a non-qualifying entity owns it, they have to find basically a partner that lease it under, that is a qualifying nonprofit. So with that, there has to be a long-term lease of 35 years or more, but if they are able to do that, then they will also fit under basically get a welfare exemption on that property too. If I could have you move on to page 7. Thank you. So those are the exemptions those are the welfare exemptions available for the ownership of this type of property for rental housing, and for also for during this type of housing for during the construction period. I will move on to other property tax incentives now that affect people after it's been built or after it's been sold. So under 402.1, generally 402.1, you have to consider any type of governmental restriction on property when you value it. So the assessor, when they take a look at this type of restricted property, if it's for low-income housing, they have to consider it. They have to consider it, especially if it's restricted by a governmental restriction. There are 2 exceptions to that. There is a 402.1 10A10 expands that a little bit, and the assessor must also consider restrictions placed on by entities that basically fall under that. I like to call that the Habitat for Humanity model that was put in for that, but it's not solely for Habitat. But if there's restricted by a non-governmental agency, then they must also consider that restriction. So in essence, it actually lowers their assessment by a little bit because of the restriction.
Question of clarification through the chair?
Please, yes.
Yes.
Okay, it says here in the wording, assessors to consider use.
Right.
So is that, you know how sometimes language will say may or shall? So is it really that they must accept it, or can they reject it?
Yeah. So the answer is the language is shall. So they have to consider its use. But if you read 402.1 in its totality, there are certain things that are rebuttable. So they have to consider its use as restricted. If it's designated for and restricted for low-income housing, they have to consider that. But there are presumptions in the remainder of 214 that says that restriction may or may not have an effect on its fair market value. So 402.1 is a statute that requires you to take a look at the value as restricted. It's a fair market value, but as restricted. So it is a shall, but there are
Yes,
there
okay.
are parts of the
Great,
law
thank
that
you.
lets them. And then if I could have you move on to page 8. And the other portion of 402.1 I wanted to highlight is actually 402.1 A11. A11 basically does the same thing for community land trusts. Property owned by community land trust, they are also considered restricted, and the assessor shall consider its use as restricted. So it basically follows the Habitat for Humanity model. Thank you. Now I will move on. So that covers its restricted value, how restrictions on valuation can assist affordable housing in California. So next, page 10, we're already there. There are a couple of other property tax exemptions that may help affordable housing. The first one is a very general exemption. and that is the homeowner's exemption. So on your primary residence, you are allowed a $7,000 exemption off of your assessed value. So whatever your assessed value is, you can claim the homeowner's exemption for your primary residence and get $7,000 off. It helps, but it's a smaller exemption. If I may have you move on to page 11. There is another.
Excuse me, when
Yes.
was the $7 put into effect?
The $7,000 exemption, I believe it's been in effect for quite a while. It has not been raised in many, many years. I believe
So
at least
it's been in
several
effect
decades.
since when you could afford a house.
Yes. There is another exemption I wanted to bring up, and that's the veterans exemption. The veterans exemption is actually a little bit less than the homeowner's exemption. It's only $4,000, and there are some real restrictions on getting the veterans exemption. You can't own property that's valued more than $5,000 or $10,000 if you're married. So that is two exemptions available. They're both relatively small. And then the last exemption I wanted to bring up is the disabled veterans exemption. So there are basically two levels of the disabled veterans exemption. The first one is called the basic disabled veterans. If you're 100% disabled and rated as such, you can apply for the disabled veterans exemption. The basic one lets you exempt $100,000 in assessed value, so it's starting to be a significant exemption. That $100,000 is factored up every year. Since it's in implementation for 2023, that basic $100,000 exemption now is actually factored up to $161,083. So through time, that basic exemption is over $160,000 now. You can get an exemption off of your primary residence. The other part of that exemption is actually a low-income disabled veterans exemption. So if you meet the income qualifications, then you may be eligible for this one. It's also known as the $150,000 exemption. As with the first one, with factoring over time, that the low-income disabled veterans exemption now is actually $241,627. So it's over $240,000 with factoring. The current income limit to qualify for that is just a little bit over $72,000. So there's disabled veterans exemption that's a little more advantageous, a low-income one, and a basic one, which basically provides the basic one somewhere low over $160,000 off of your excess value, and the low-income one is over $240,000. So with that, if you can move on to page 13. So there are 5 bills I wanted to highlight and bring before the board that may affect how low-income housing is treated tax-wise in California right now. The first one is Assembly Bill 1206, and that is an affordable housing bill. It is sponsored by the Community Land Trust, and what that actually does is that it raises when you qualify for residences that qualify initially in order to get one of these units. They have to be below 80% of the median area income. And if they surpass that, they're no longer qualified under income under the current law. If this bill gets signed into law, it will raise it up to 140% of area median income. So if a tenant qualifies initially and then makes more money, they can make up to 140% of area median income and still qualify. That means the owner of the property still gets an exemption on that unit. without this, that it would not be so for community land trust folks.
What's the dollar figure on 140%?
It depends on the area. In the Bay, I believe in Sacramento, area median income is somewhere around $100,000. I think the Bay Area may be higher, and then some areas are lower. So it
140% of that is what you
yeah. So on the high dollar counties, a family could make up to $140,000 and still qualify for it, meaning the developers and the owners of that rental property can keep the exemption on that unit.
That's for a family of four? Is that what it's based on?
I believe it's on the top of the scale. I don't know if it's family of four or greater.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
believe it's right around there, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And that's for a high dollar county,
Yeah. Thank you.
of course. The next piece of legislation, so that actually has made it through the legislative process. It is forwarded to the governor to sign into law. So the next one I wanted to highlight is also Assembly Bill 1933. We had a little bit of discussion on that yesterday, and what that actually does is that it expands. I talked about 214.15. This law proposes to create 214.15.1. Basically, it expands the exclusion for property that is being held and developed for low-income housing. So once again, that has gone through the legislative process. It is now also with the governor to sign for his action. Third bill I wanted to highlight is Assembly Bill 2651. This bill proposes to extend the same welfare exemption for property owned by a community land trust while it is being held for development or under construction. Currently, that portion of the exemption would sunset on January 1 of 2025. If this bill becomes law, it will extend it for 2 years. It will extend it to 2027. And then lastly, I have two bills that I will just mention briefly because they did not make it through the legislative process, and they are not in consideration anymore for this year, for this legislative session. And that is Assembly Bill 1357. This bill would have basically provided a disabled veterans exemption for the full value, the full assessed value of the home. That didn't make it, so it's not in consideration anymore. And the very last bill that I want to mention is Senate Bill 1456. And I mentioned that under 214G, that if a developer does not use either tax credits or government financing, then they can still fit the property under the welfare exemption, but there's a $20 million cap on assessed value. This bill, had it made it through, would have removed the $20 million cap. So that is no longer in consideration either. So with that, we've talked about the constitutional authorities that provide the ability to exempt real property. We've talked about 214 that provides the general exemption, the 214.15 and .18 that provides the exemption for properties that are being held and under construction. And we've talked about 5 legislative proposals, 3 that are making its way through, and the other 2 are no longer in contention. With that, that concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. Appreciate your presentation. Mr. Schaefer?
Mr. Young, we talked about the $4,000 veterans exemption,
Right.
which I think is ridiculous by its size when the other exemptions that we respect are $100,000 or more. And then I'm appalled to hear that if the veteran happens to own $10,000 of the property, he or she cannot qualify for the 4,000. Well, 10,000 worth of property is maybe an average used car. Is anybody speaking up for the veterans? I'm not a legislator, or I'd get out my pen. I would like to see you consider that we bring this attention to some of the legislators that we work with, and I think it'd be very popular by both parties to come into the year 2022.
Thank you. I agree with you. The standard veterans exemption, not the disabled, but standard veterans exemption, it is, the value limit on the exemption amount is relatively low, and the value limit is of total property you own is very restrictive. As such, it is not used much in the state. The standard.
Well, of course it's not used. It's worthless.
Wait, hold on a minute,
Yeah.
because we're getting off topic,
We're
and we
getting
need
a
to keep
little bit
moving
off
forward.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But,
Yeah.
Mr. Schaefer, basically, that's our job. Our job is to go to the members of the legislature. Your representatives, we could start with your representatives down from the Senate and the Assembly, but that's our job to
Yeah,
go ahead and
okay,
advocate.
You're
and-
right,
and-
you're
and
right. I
advocate
stand
on
corrected, and
legislation.
I want that to be my job.
So, Mr. Young, we
Yes, of
appreciate your
course.
presentation. Mr. Vasquez has a question, and then we're going to move on to the next speaker. Yes.
Just real quick,
Yes.
thank you for your presentation, but I was interested in, you mentioned 402.1
Yes.
a couple times there, and on when they use I guess a nonprofit basically is strictly limited to the low-income housing by the city or the county, is there a presumption that the property is restricted under section 402.1 and the value should conform to any other like properties?
If it's restricted by a city or governmental agency, that, in our opinion, the board's opinion has always been that if it's a governmental restricted, they should and shall take that into consideration. So the answer is yes.
Yes. And then my last one was just, and what is you touched on it, but what is your definition of a regulatory agreement?
A regulatory agreement is an agreement basically that states how many units that will be affordable housing, what the rental rates will be, what their criteria and for screening tenants and whatnot are. So each one of them they can be unique to each development and each property, but in general it is restrictions upon income levels, use, and whatnot.
So they're somewhat customized to the area?
Somewhat customized to the area and somewhat to the specific development.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Yes,
Senator?
I just wanted to go back to the exemption issue. I thought
Yes.
Member Schaefer made a great point on the veterans issue and trying to increase that exemption. We do need to work through the legislature on that. I voted on many of those when I was in the legislature, and we just weren't able to get it through. Another related aspect is the $7,000 homeowners exemption,
Yes.
and this varies dramatically from state to state. For instance, I was just looking up state of Idaho. I did a Google search on that, and they're showing homeowners exemption is 50% of the value of the home and up to 1 acre of land, with a maximum of $125,000. And their housing costs, while they've been increasing in the Boise region and other parts of the state, still a lot cheaper to buy a home there than it is here in California. So I think there's a lot that we could do, that we could advocate for as a board in terms of trying to figure out what our priorities are and trying to provide relief on both fronts, both on the rental front for folks, but also on home ownership. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Young, appreciate you and your perspective.
Thank
We are
you.
going to keep moving forward. Mr. Keddy, could you call the next speaker?
The next item on today's board work group agenda is the color of housing, systematic racism, equity, and access to capital and financing. The first speaker on this is Mr. Fred Blackwell, President and CEO, San Francisco Foundation.
Mr. Blackwell, thanks for making the trek up. It's good to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a legend in the space. We're lucky to have him, and I've been looking forward to your presentation.
All right.
You may begin.
Thank you, Chairperson Cohen, and thank you to the members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I really want to applaud you all for taking up this issue. It's a really important issue in my community, which is the San Francisco Bay Area, but as you know, it's a really important issue for the state of California as well. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to offer a little bit of perspective. As the chair said, I'm Fred Blackwell. I'm the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. We are a 75-year-old community foundation serving the Bay Area. We're the San Francisco Foundation, but we have a regional footprint in the Bay. So in the East Bay, we are in Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and along the coast, Marin, San Mateo, and San Francisco counties. We have about $2 billion of assets under management, probably a little bit less today after the markets, but that work is really guided by a kind of long-standing focus in on making the Bay Area a better place to live, work, and play. And we've been pretty consistent in our history in being a kind of social justice-oriented grant maker in the Bay Area. In 2015, we actually kind of reorganized our foundation to do all of its work guided by a North Star that's about creating a greater degree of racial equity and economic inclusion in the region. And we did that in response to both what we were hearing from the communities that we were serving and to the data that we were seeing. I mean, at the time, basically what we were experiencing in the Bay Area and what people were expressing to us was that there was a tremendous amount of kind of prosperity, economic growth, and wealth being generated in the region, and access to it was limited. And for far too many people, it was the access was limited based on where they lived, what their family's economic status might be, and something as simple as their race and or ethnicity. And since that time, and shortly after we developed that North Star, we developed a pretty comprehensive focus in on housing. And we did that in response to the data that we were seeing, and again, the things that we were hearing from community. We held a series of town hall meetings throughout the Bay Area, and people were pretty consistently talking about concerns about displacement, concerns around homelessness, concerns around housing affordability, and concerns around gentrification and displacement. And so we decided to respond to that, and we decided to respond in a way that I would characterize as kind of a all-in approach. So we are making grants to affordable housing developers at the San Francisco Foundation. We are making loans for affordable housing production. We are using our convening power to bring together stakeholders who agree that there's a problem around housing, but often disagree, sometimes violently, around what the solution should be. And as a result of that work, that convening work, we have pulled together a partnership called the Partnership for the Bay's Future that includes public entities, it includes nonprofit organizations, but it also includes the corporate sector. And two things have been created as a result of that partnership. One is a $500 million investment fund that seeks to bring more private capital and philanthropic capital into the affordable housing production marketplace to augment and supplement what the public is investing. And the other is a policy fund where we are providing support directly to local jurisdictions in the Bay Area who are developing new housing policies to try to be responsive to the circumstances in their communities. We're also using resources to provide folks in local government with additional staff to actually develop and implement those policies. We've also been involved in legislative work. Probably about 2 or 3 legislative cycles ago, we were associated with about 12 or 13 different pieces of legislation focusing on housing production, focusing in on the protection of tenants, but also on the preservation of existing affordable housing as well. We've done all of that because we've seen, and the community's been telling us, that an important part of addressing equity in the region is being able to address the housing crisis. I want to offer up 3 or so things that we've learned or lessons that we have picked up along the way, because I think that they could respectfully maybe add value to some of the strategies that you all are thinking about. One is that the outcomes that are being experienced from a housing perspective in the Bay Area specifically, in the state of California generally, are outcomes that are disproportionately negatively impacting communities of color. If you look at home ownership rates, if you look at the amount of rent burden and burden that is associated with home ownership, burden being defined as spending more than 30% of your income on housing, Black and Latinx communities are disproportionately impacted there. High proportions of those populations are rent burden. You only have to do a windshield survey to see the color and the complexion of the homeless populations in places like Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, Richmond. All those things, I think, are things to keep in mind, but the real important thing here is that we didn't arrive here by accident. But we arrived here through exclusionary zoning tactics that have been implemented across the state, and particularly wealthy communities and communities that have high areas of opportunity. We have gotten here through redlining practices where communities of color have had unequal access to capital to purchase homes, to invest in their homes, to revitalize their homes, to keep up with maintenance. We have arrived here because of land use policies and practices that have been discriminatory in low-income communities. You can point to things like the West Oakland BART station, things like the West Oakland
Unfortunately, these
post
folks
office.
are not that familiar with kind of the Bay
so
Area. You're speaking my
describe it-
language.
I'll describe it in more
Yeah,
detail.
yeah.
Communities where historic African-American Latinx communities have basically been displaced through policies and decisions that have been made to advance the public good through their communities. So building new freeways through low-income communities and communities of color, building new monuments in those same communities, tearing down existing homes and businesses in order to revitalize those areas without consideration for the existing culture, complexion of the neighborhood. All of those kinds of things. I just pointed to West Oakland, but you can see examples of that in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Richmond, Berkeley, you name it. And also uneven access to even public dollars and policies that are intended to improve home ownership and things like that. For example, the GI Bill. The GI Bill was used to spark home ownership for a large proportion of the population decades ago. Black people were excluded from being able to participate in the GI Bill in ways that other communities were. So my point is that we haven't gotten here by accident. It's not the fault of low-income communities and communities of color that they are disproportionately impacted by these issues. We have put into place policies and procedures and practices that have had racial undertones and overtones to them that have gotten us to this place. And so that's one of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind. Because low-income communities and communities of color have been disproportionately impacted, the second thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that we have to design solutions that really make sure that the folks who are most impacted benefit from the things that we're doing. The best example that I can give to you all about that is curb cuts. I'm sure all of you all are familiar with curb cuts. They're where the sidewalk actually goes down to the street. They were basically created as a result of the advocacy for people who have mobile disabilities so that they can get from one side of the street to the other just the way everybody else could who didn't have mobile impairments. But if you were just to kind of take a step back and look at curb cuts and kind of just do your own survey of kind of who's using them, what you will see is the young mother with the baby carriage. You will see the lawyer with the suitcase full of briefs. You will see the catering service going from one job to the other. Curb cuts are the perfect example of us designing a solution for a population of people that were probably least likely to be able to benefit from some of these things, but how everybody benefits from that solution. And I would say that we need to have a curb-cut approach when we are thinking about solutions to housing. We have to make sure that we are designing these solutions with the folks who are most impacted, least likely to benefit from these solutions, that are put kind of at the front of the line, and also designed to make sure that they benefit and to make sure that we all benefit as a result. Last thing I would say here that we've learned is an important lesson and approach is that wealthy communities cannot be let off the hook. We have seen that the exclusionary policies and practices in zoning that I've talked about at the top that have led to the problems that we're facing today are still being utilized in some communities, and therefore they are not producing their share of housing generally and their share of affordable housing more specifically. And what that does is it makes sure that folks who have limited incomes are not experiencing the same benefits that exist for communities that have high opportunity, communities that have good schools, communities that have high quality infrastructure, communities that have high tax bases that allow for them to keep up with those infrastructure investments. So all three of those things are things that I think we all need to be taking into account as we develop new housing policies and approaches. The fact that we haven't gotten here by accident, that we have to take a curb-cut approach to making sure that everybody benefits, and that we cannot let communities of opportunity off the hook when it comes to developing their fair share of housing generally and affordable housing more specifically. So I'll stop there. Again, pleasure to be with you. Applaud you for taking up this issue and hope to be able to work in partnership with you as you continue to roll up your sleeves.
Question, do you have examples of ways to keep wealthier communities accountable? Is there an established successful model? Is it policy? Is it, what do you
Yeah,
suggest?
there are a few things that have been tried and beaten back by those communities. So, for example, there have been a number of pieces of legislation that seek to loosen the regulatory environment when it comes to developing affordable housing. And those have been met with limited success in the legislature. There are examples of the fact that these communities are able to do the things that they're doing with basically impunity. And so what if we were to make sure that folks who wanted to get more money for widening of freeways and improving their streets develop their fair share of affordable housing in order to get access to those kinds of dollars. Those are the kinds of things that have been talked about. They're the kinds of things that public agencies and legislation have tried to advance, and frankly, the strength of the political will of those communities have beaten back a lot of those examples, and we know those are things that work.
Appreciate that. I think I saw Mr. Vasquez's hand.
I appreciate your comments and your history, and given your experience, especially since you represent, or I guess your nonprofit works with some of the very high-end counties in the state of California. I'm down in LA County, and I grew up in Santa Monica and the Venice area, and as a kid, Venice, for example, west of Lincoln, which is right up against the beach, was like 80% African American as a kid. Now it's maybe 10% because they were all renters. And while we want to protect, obviously people's homes, and then you hit it right on the nail when you're talking about communities of color are always subject to all the improvements like freeways. My wife lived on the 10 freeway before it existed, and they got displaced. And that happens throughout the state of California. And you're right, this is something that it just didn't happen by accident. These were things that were planned for those that were in power back in the day. But now we have a new California as we're seeing more and more people of color getting elected. In your experience, what do you think we need to do to make sure we correct a lot of those wrongs as we move forward, whether it's a tax credit or a tax abatement? Because I'm not convinced that any housing is good housing. In Santa Monica, one of the problems we have is we have a lot of high-end housing that's vacant, but who can afford the $6,000, $7,000 a month to rent these things? What we need is like true workforce housing, because I'm sure you experience it, especially in San Francisco, like in Santa Monica, you have a lot of service folks working in the service industry that clean the hotels and work in the kitchens and the restaurants, but can't afford to live there. Many of them are commuting. Some, I understand, are even probably commuting from Sacramento to San Francisco. So the commute is just huge. And how do we bring them into the areas of employment?
Yeah, you know, I don't have a silver bullet for the challenges that we're trying to address, but there are a few things that I would name that I think are important. One is I think that probably by now we've kind of concluded that trickle-down economics isn't a policy approach that works for low-income communities. The same can be said for housing. A trickle-down approach for housing where we just targeted the higher income end of the spectrum and hope that by developing more housing generally, we will be able to address what is basically oversimplified as a supply and demand problem is not going to be enough. So we've got to produce housing at all levels of affordability, and we have to have adequate funding streams for the kind of affordable housing component and the piece that you're talking about, like which is the missing middle as well. And we have to simultaneously preserve what we have in terms of affordable housing, because if we're just if we're losing as much affordable housing as we're developing, it's a net zero in terms of what we are gaining. But last, we've got to protect tenants. And we've done a lot to do that over the last couple of years during COVID with eviction prevention and rental assistance and things like that. And we've got to be able to do that too. And they all have to be done at once. I think one of the things that I've seen that is really, I think, preventing us from developing solutions at the level of scale that we need to is that every group feels like they have the silver bullet. So if you're a home builder, you think that the silver bullet is we need to build more homes. If you're an affordable housing person, you think that the silver bullet is more affordable housing. If you are a tenant protection advocate, you think that the silver bullet is tenant protection. The reality is all of these things have to happen at once, and folks have to be willing to compromise in order to get what they want so that all these things can happen. And so I think that the solution is to be able to do these things at once, to be able to develop affordable housing funding streams that are sustainable. We lost a lot of money, dedicated money for affordable housing when we lost redevelopment agencies. That was $1 billion a year statewide for affordable housing. We still have not replaced that. One of the things that we are working on with a group of advocates is seeing if we can move the voter threshold for affordable housing approval from 66%, where it currently is now, to a simple majority. I can't tell you how many times I've worked on affordable housing bond measures at the local level where we've gotten 55% or 58% or 60% and not been able to get to that magical 66%. That means that you're talking about the vast majority of folks want to see these things happen, but they're unable to make it happen because they haven't been able to get to that supermajority. So that's another very practical thing that I think we can do to get more public funding into the stream. But the last thing I will say is that it shouldn't just be all on the public. We've talked about, and I mentioned earlier, the Partnership for the Bay's Future, that where we're working on getting more corporate money, more philanthropic dollars into the affordable housing funding stream. I think that will be key too.
No, I agree with you on that. And you're right. I think we have to come at it at all angles. But you, in your remarks earlier, you mentioned that you also provide loans. Are those like bridge loans for those folks that are kind of waiting for these approvals? Because I know we at the state level, we're not doing such a good job of streamlining the approval process.
Yeah, so,
what do you recommend we
yeah,
do that?
that's exactly right. So we have a funding pool that kind of tries to fill a gap in the marketplace, which is even when you do these affordable housing bonds, it takes a while for the rules and regulations to get in place for it to move it through the process. And what some affordable housing developers need is kind of pre-development money and bridge money to do the acquisition work, to do the CEQA work, to do the entitlement work before they can access the public dollars. And so that is one of the things that we kind of use our pool to support.
Thank you.
Any questions on this one, Senator Gaines?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I appreciate your presentation, and I agree that it kind of takes all different types of housing to solve the issues. My question is in terms of home ownership.
Yeah.
How realistic is it, and is there a pathway for home ownership in the Bay Area, and I imagine that would be a pretty small home, but anything, I'm a real believer in the ability to buy a home, pay it off over 30 years, and you've got a nest egg, you've got equity, you've got inheritance that can then be passed on.
Well, we got Prop 19.
Well, we've got to solve Prop 19 for sure. But can you speak to that in terms of what is happening? What are the opportunities? I keep hearing stories about the fee structure too being very high on building a new home in the Bay Area.
That's right. I have to admit, most of our work is kind of on the kind of rental side and that side of work. But I will tell you a few things that we've seen and things that we've seen people working on. One that you all have already seemed to be discussing is community land trust models where property can be acquired and the covenants make it permanently affordable. I think the downside to some of those programs that you don't experience if you're living in a land trust unit or house the same kind of appreciation and the ability to build equity as you have, like what you're talking about.
Would that be shared equity?
Traditional
example?
30,
like a shared equity example. Yeah.
And sometimes forget what the term of art is, but it's capped equity. So you can get up to a certain point
amount.
and beyond that it goes back into the land trust.
Okay.
So that's one approach. The other is, there are some folks who are doing work, and you kind of hinted at this, to bring down the cost of the production of new housing. So there are places like Factory OS in Vallejo, for example, that are doing prefabbed homes and things like that to bring down the cost of materials and the like. And I think that that's another important part of the equation. And then the other thing we've seen is jurisdictions that are targeting specific populations for home ownership assistance, teachers, first responders, and folks like that who get at, early access to and more access to down payment assistance programs and things like that. So those are just three things that we're seeing. I think the thing that we're not seeing is that any of those seem to be able to be implemented, at least now, at a level of scale that really has an impact. They all feel like they're working kind of at a boutique level of scale. And so I think the next challenge is one about scale.
Yeah, very well. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Blackwell, thank you for your presentation. Senator, just wanted to point out that in David Young's presentation, you talked about community land trust legislation that is making its way through the legislature. I think it's headed towards the governor's desk, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Community land trust, which actually would increase the cap that Mr. Blackwell was talking about. So we got to keep moving. We got an aggressive agenda today. Really exciting. Thank you for your time and your expertise. I think we have Beatrice Olvera Stoltz online. And folks, I just want to recognize that we've got about 243 folks that are online joining us that are streaming today. So very exciting. Ms. Stotzer, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today. My name is B. Stotzer. I am the board chair and founder of New Economics for Women. It's a Latina community economic organization and the developer of affordable housing for nearly 30-some years. It is an honor to be here with you today and share some ideas and really thank Mr. Blackwell for bringing up a couple of the issues that I had already were considering of discussing, and he did such a great job.
Ms. Stotzer, before pardon the intrusion, are you able to turn your camera on?
Hold on just a second. I thought it was on. Is it on now?
No. We can't see it. Oh, there you are. We see you now. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Okay.
It was on before. I don't know why it wasn't on.
That's okay. It might be on our end.
Sure. One of the things I'd like to start with is a context, and I think in all of your hearings has been missed. The state of California has organized affordable housing around the TCAC model, which is, and it's limited its affordability to 60% of AMI, and now is considering 80%. There are many, many states, including Colorado, that uses their tax credit incentive programs and bond programs up to 120% of the AMI, which is a federal level. But for some reason, the state of California does not. I believe that that has been one of the critical issues that the state has not been able to address for a long time. The other issue in terms of the Latina community and how we've done our affordability, we have had experience building multifamily, new construction, acquisition and rehab, single family construction, modular construction. But the whole financial structure of affordable housing centers around multifamily, not single family housing. And we have provided covenants for our single family developments as a commitment to affordability, but it's been very, very difficult to address it for the long term. The development deals that are recognize the nonprofit and private partners to build low and moderate income households is just not there as it should be. And we believe BOE has an incredible opportunity to create a graduated incentive for tax exemption, not only for multifamily, but also especially for single family. I think it's a tool that can be used in order to provide high resource communities like Santa Monica, like Beverly Hills, to really help private and nonprofit, development to occur when you have a graduated tax exemption opportunity. One of the things that I think we have not understood is that low-income housing under the rules is just too narrowly defined, as I have stated. It only really deals with limited partnership, utilizing tax credit when there's a general managing partner as a nonprofit. It really doesn't deal with other forms of entities in order to get the tax exemption and affordability dollars. Everybody assumes that LIHTC housing is a primary method of financing and getting the subsidies for affordable housing. And it's no longer the case. Developers do not want to use that tool as much as we would like them to, because it is just too cumbersome, expensive, and it doesn't take long. And there's not coordination where it's predictable in terms of having your deal go through. The competition is just too onerous. We believe that BOE can be a champion of affordable housing if it is able to create innovation and collaboration with all of the tools between all of the entities, city, county, as well as state, in creating that kind of affordability and graduated tax exemption. When we look at our opportunities, for example, the approaches that we have done, right now Caltrans is bidding out their properties that they have owned for the last 35 years. However, the affordability covenants may not allow for a qualified tax exemption because the properties are single family and they're rental. The tax exemption does not necessarily allow for the county to use that because they're rental. We are having a hard time, people to place vouchers, Section 8 vouchers again, because the requirements are so onerous. But for rental properties, owners that want to, use Section 8 don't do that because the incentives are just not there. So what I believe that can be done in allowing for us to really address critical affordable housing is to help drive not only home ownership, but rental housing for communities of color that allow nonprofits to be able to get tax exemption for rentals in single family communities will be a great, great help. You can expand the rules and ensure that nonprofits are the ones that can be able to buy the auction homes. Right now, there is no real process other than for some cities and counties to say that they're given first look, but there is no mandate to require that they be first to buy and have a process for them to be able to do so. We need your support and we need your innovation in order to be able to use the tax exemption rules to be able to, really see how we can bring down the cost of rental housing so it could be affordable for all incomes, especially poor working families who cannot find housing in multifamily or single-family homes. So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Oh, yes, thank you very much for making time. I'm going to acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Vasquez.
How you doing, B?
Oh, thank you so much.
You
Your
mentioned the Caltrans properties. I'm assuming you're talking about the ones on the old 710 in El Sereno? Are they up for sale now?
Yes, they are.
And you're
South
saying
Pasadena will see-
you as a nonprofit, you don't qualify or they're not exempt?
Because, no, we do, we're an HRE, so we will be bidding on the properties hopefully, and if we're successful. However, they do not qualify to be tax exempt because they're rentals once we have them.
So what she's saying is that we need to change that.
You need to change that, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a legislative fix.
And the other one I was asking, when I asked most of especially the developers here today, is at the state level, I'm hearing that we're somewhat of a stumbling block because we have all these commissions and approvals that you all need to go through, and we need to do a better job of streamlining it. What are your thoughts on how do we fast track this?
Well, the regulatory issues around tax exempt around tax credit properties are really onerous. And I just don't understand many a time why it takes, so long. It takes you 3 years to go through funding process in order to do affordable housing, multifamily. Yes, the regulations are very, very high. The competition is very, very high. So that is why the rules are there to be able to only, screen out those that are not cost effective. So you have to build more units, cheaper units to get the points, to get the housing, to get the tax credits. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the best kind of housing. It just means it's the cheaper, faster way that the state wants it. The other thing I think that we need to understand is there are only a certain amount of money that the state has to be able to subsidize affordable housing. There are other ways to subsidize affordable housing. One of them is a tax exemption, a graduated tax exemption. I'm not advocating for not paying property taxes. I'm advocating that it be a graduated scale, especially if it's going to be affordable for working families and it's owned by nonprofits, and developers that can subsidize market rate units in order to help the lower income units be able to pencil out. There should be rules and regulations that incentivize that rather than does not recognize that can be done. Also, we need to recognize the fact that government cannot do it by itself, as well as Mr. Blackwell said. All of us need to understand the city government is much more of an impediment to affordability many times than it is the state. And that we need to change the rules to allow affordability to be up to 140% or 150% of AMI. So all those income levels, the families that can work, that are working families can be able to have affordable housing. Right now, for example, if you're a minimum wage job and both the parents are working, do not qualify for a 60% unit because now minimum wage is at $16 to $18 an hour, and they're over income already. And yet they cannot find any kind of units in LA that pay less than $2,000 a month for a one bedroom. It is insanity. Families are, especially Latino families in LA, are having a huge amount of crisis in finding units and single family homes in order to rent at affordable rates.
Thank you.
Ms. Stotzer, what you're describing is the same challenges, the same pressures that we're feeling in the Bay Area when it comes to the Latino community, when it comes to the African American community, and just overall immigrant communities that are struggling to find housing and to stay in the areas where they're raising their families, where they have generational ties, where their kids are in school. So this conversation is timely. Let me look to my left, colleagues. We've got a comment from Senator Gaines.
Yeah, thank you so much, B. I hope you're okay with me using B. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. That last statement you made in terms of $2,000 for a one-bedroom
Yes.
apartment, I'm assuming in L.A.?
Yes. Homes are now at 3,000. If you find a home, a single-family home to rent less than 3,000, you're very lucky.
Okay, all right. So what are those folks doing? We talked a little bit about an out-migration of people from the state of California, and I'm just curious as to whether you're seeing that happening with low-income families that can't find the housing that they're looking for. Where are these people living, and if they can't find a spot, where are they going?
Well, it's a density issue. They double up or triple up depending on where, what they can find in many situations. We also provide down payment assistance as well as homeownership counseling, and we find many of the families that are buying homes are in outlying areas in the desert or out of state, especially I believe there's parts of Texas, Nevada, Arizona that they're finding homes and just moving out.
Yeah,
The incentive, how should I say this? One of the other issues that I would like to bring to your attention is for the city of Los Angeles, as in many other cities that we're working with, they do not have the capacity to perform financial deals as much as they want to. There's just not enough staff. And there's not enough expertise out there to be able to move any kind of programs through the city council or the state agencies and county, especially because it just takes so long for things to get done. A lot of that is because of COVID, but we need to really understand that if we're going to resource affordable housing, it has to be done on the local level more so than it is on the state.
Okay. Well, thank you. Has there been any discussion about the state picking up more infrastructure costs so the fee burden is not so high on new construction? Because I've heard a number as high as $200,000 a unit in fees before you even break ground on a home in the Bay Area, and I would imagine LA would be similar. And of course, these are pass-throughs, right? So the infrastructure is required to be built, maybe parks, things of that nature. And then that's passed on to the buyer of the home in the form of fees, right? Or it brings up the cost of the house. And I'm just wondering if there could be is there any discussion on reprioritizing infrastructure on a statewide basis so that the home buyer and also in the case of rental units, right, you're still paying fees on every unit that's built to try to bring those down to a more affordable level.
I don't know of anything that would make a big dent. You have to understand when it comes to affordable housing, just inspection fees alone, you have 3 or 4 agencies charging you door fees just to have income verification. And to be able to even get some of the units online, it's costing, I think, down to about 30 to 35% of the development cost with local and state fees. So that is an area of opportunity.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, thank you. We appreciate your time and your expertise. We're going to have to keep moving. Ms. Cicchetti?
Did we want to go out to the AT&T moderator?
Yes, for public comment.
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
AT&T moderator, please let us know if there's anyone on the line who'd like to make a public comment regarding this item.
Thank you. To queue up to make comment, please press 10 at this time. We have no callers in queue.
All right, let's keep moving
We'll
forward.
go to the next item. The next item is item 4 on today's board workgroup agenda, examining the impact of abatements and incentivize the development of housing in California. Why do abatements matter? Our first speaker will be virtual. Sean Spear, President and CEO, Community Housing Works, and former Assistant General Manager of Housing Development, City of Los Angeles, Housing Plus Community Investment Department.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Spears. Good to see you. I'm wondering, is Deborah Norwood Rain also joining us? Okay, she's out in the audience. Oh, there you are. Thank you. Okay. All right, Mr. Spears, welcome. Good to see you. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Chairman Cohen and members of the board. Thank you for inviting me to this, what will hopefully be a informative and thoughtful discussion that you all are having. And I want to thank you all for taking up this question. I think, as you're well aware, the challenges that we have in the affordable housing industry are great in attempting to meet the housing crisis and the challenges that come along with that. For us at Community Housing Works, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization headquartered in San Diego. We were founded in 1988, and over the course of the years have produced over 3,800 units of affordable housing for working families, seniors, and those with special needs, including supportive housing for the formerly homeless. We are primarily active in San Diego County, but have properties across the state, including in LA County, Santa Clara County, Contra Costa County, Sacramento, and Fresno. So we have a fair amount of experience in working with county assessors' offices and others and when it comes to filing for the welfare tax exemption, and have, I think, a good process in terms of being able to file for those and secure them as is necessary for our affordable housing development work. But at the same time, there may be some opportunities for you all to look at some improvements that could ultimately help in smoothing the process for affordable housing to qualify and secure the exemption. I wanted to give you, and I'm not sure if I'm able to share my screen, but if not, I'm just going to kind of give you the verbal example of what we typically do with securing the welfare exemption.
Let me see. Are we able to see a screen? I'm
Yes.
told yes.
Okay, great. Let me go ahead and do that. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as I was mentioning, we've done 44 communities in various parts of the state and have been listed amongst the top 50 affordable housing developers in the nation. I wanted to give you a case study, so to speak, of the value of the welfare tax exemption on our deals. Parkside Terrace, which is located in San Jose, is a 201 unit development that we purchased a couple years ago. The combination of both the acquisition cost and the rehabilitation cost with that property exceeded $100 million at the end of the day. Real estate is very expensive in San Jose, as you're probably well aware. The Santa Clara County then identified an assessed value of a little over $38 million for the property. That's based upon the restricted value, which includes the fact that it's restricted as affordable housing. Based upon that tax rate, it translates to an annual savings for the property of a slightly less than $500,000 a year. Now, while each tax dollar that the county can secure is very important towards providing the services and the public needs, at the same time, those $500,000 actually goes much further than just simply dollar for dollar transfer to other services. It allows us as affordable housing developers to leverage that savings for additional perm loan debt that would come from the private sector. That translates to, in this case, would be roughly $6.7 million in additional debt that we could float on the property to help pay for its acquisition and preservation. And those dollars are dollars that come into that community from the lending community. And so it acts as really a catalyst for additional investment and additional opportunity in that sense. So the welfare tax exemption really acts as an investment in affordable housing that also gets leveraged to a greater extent by the activity that's created associated with that. Now, this was an acquisition of an existing property. You can imagine that this is also magnified when it comes to developing new properties in the communities. Now, I do want to highlight that we pride ourselves on the working relationships we have with the counties, and particularly with the county assessors in terms of walking through the process. However, I will tell you that the fact that we, over the course of a process that typically takes anywhere from a minimum of 1.5 years to as much as 3 years to secure the welfare tax exemption, it is a process that also involves us preparing and submitting as much as 16 different forms and background documents to the county assessor, as well as the BOE. And that depending on the jurisdiction, that can be fairly predictable, but in some jurisdictions it's not in terms of the timing. And the fact that this is usually a threshold requirement for us to be able to operate and financially operate our properties means that any delay or in its processing can translate to us jeopardizing the financing for an affordable housing development. So, my staff wanted me to kind of give what we thought were some fine-tuning recommendations to the process. But, every once in a while, my inner New Yorker comes out, and I would say that this is one of those times where I look at the situation and want to think about what can we do to actually improve this as a statewide system. And in my mind, you already have existing state agencies that cover most affordable housing built, whether it's from receiving subsidy loans from HCD or from tax credits, as B. Stotzer mentioned earlier, through whether it's the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee or California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. They also will confirm when the restrictions are put in place. They will then confirm what they are also informed when lease-up has occurred and the property is in operation. They have annual reporting and periodic on-site inspection, and they have significant enforcement and financial penalty tools available to them if the property is not in compliance with its restrictions. So I say all of that to say that there is an existing apparatus that most of the affordable housing in the state already takes advantage of, and that can act as an enforcement vehicle for the welfare tax exemption. In addition, they have reporting on the status of their properties, and that's something that can be reported out, frankly, to the individual counties and hopefully be able to streamline. Ideally, if the exemption was filed for when the property closes on construction and is confirmed when CDLAC or TCAC get confirmation of the completion and operation of the projects, I think that could translate to some really meaningful reductions in costs that the county assessors' offices themselves, as well as the BOE, take on when reviewing each and every individual deal. I think that streamlining can be very helpful, at least into projects itself, in terms of making a greater amount of assuredness on the financing side and on the operational side. So I would invite some thoughts around that as you guys go forward to see if there can be a way for you to partner more closely with the state housing finance agencies that actually already touch and enforce these provisions. Also want to speak to what I think in general you are also discussing ideas around supporting workforce housing and moderate income housing. I think all of us can recognize that there is a growing crisis that is spreading beyond serving the very low and low income households, and the need for us to also address moderate income. I know you're having other folks that will be speaking in a few minutes about programs in, for instance, in New York and in other places that are very successful in supporting moderate income housing development. I think that while your affordable housing industry here in this state is very mature and very capable of doing a great deal more of affordable housing development if there were a greater amount of resources. But I think there's also the need to enlist the market rate community as well, particularly where they can support moderate income housing. And if there are ways for, whether it's through abatement programs or other as of right resources that can be made available, I think being able to serve the moderate income levels would be really helpful in terms of having to address that issue as well. So I'm going to pause there and see if you all have any questions. Again, really thank you for allowing me to speak in front of you today.
Great. We're actually happy to hear from you. Could you go back and summarize the recommendations that you have for the Board of Equalization?
So I think the first would be the notion of seeing if there's a way to, rather than having the board and the county assessors individually evaluate each property and go through both the OCC and SCC filings, to simply rely on the other state agencies in terms of their enforcement work that they do around the affordability restrictions. If you were able to, in essence, receive their list of projects that have been approved and gone through the process, and that will have a affordability restriction in place with a nonprofit also being part of that, that would be ideal, just to be able to work off of them as opposed to us having to take the time to file individually with the counties.
Okay. My colleagues are asking for a copy of your handout, of your slides. If you could email it to us, your contact, we will disseminate it with us up here. And
Sure.
I know you had 3 recommendations on that slide, so
Yeah.
I'll just read the other 2, just
Sure.
to be respectful of in the interest of time. Any other questions or comments for Mr. Spears? No? Okay, thank you. This is actually moving our conversation in a positive direction. I appreciate your time. I am going to now call up our next speaker.
Mr. Spear, Vice Chair Schaefer, I just wanted to thank somebody from San Diego for popping in on us. Happy to see you.
Sure. Every once in a while we do show up. So yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Keddy, could you call the next speaker?
The next speaker that we have is Deborah Norwood Ruane, founder and managing partner, Norwood Development Strategies, and former executive vice president, chief strategy officer, San Diego Housing Commission. And along with her is Seth Gorey.
Great, thank you very much. So we appreciate you coming all the way up from San Diego to join us and be with us in our chambers today. Welcome. I hope you had a safe trip.
We did. Thank you so much for being here. We're honored. Also, extremely excited to be on a panel with Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Spears and Mr. Stivers. This is a great opportunity. As was introduced, I'm Debbie Ruane with Norwood Development Strategies, and this is Seth Gorey. We're representing the Middlemarch Fund, which is in partnership with an organization called Civic Communities, also in San Diego. Civic is an incredible organization that has invested in Middlemarch due to its belief that we need more middle-income housing. So I have a PowerPoint. If we could go to the second slide, please. I formed Middlemarch based on this massive need for housing and as a way to augment the very successful work being done by the affordable housing community. But what we were trying to do is extend the reach of subsidized housing into the middle income without necessarily utilizing public funds, such as tax credits and bonds. So not only when I was at the San Diego Housing Commission for 9 years, our portfolio of thousands of units became 99% occupied. But what was more telling was people weren't moving out. The tenure was extending because the gap between the high limit of subsidized housing and the market rate rents were growing larger and larger and larger. And so without the turnover, we were exacerbating homelessness. We are not allowing your new recent graduates or your seniors on fixed income to find housing they can afford. Next slide, please. traditionally, there were two different types of housing, affordable and market rate. Well, what we saw was we needed to create a middle group that creates a continuum of housing opportunities for people so that they can move up and out of the subsidized units into affordable market rate housing. Next slide, please. We're not building housing, mostly because of high development costs, and what is happening is that there is land available. It always doesn't necessarily work for affordable housing because you need to be proximate to amenities such as mass transit, schools, but there are so many sites in California that are just outside of that income, that radius, that could be developed for middle income. A lot of these, though, are in communities that aren't desirable to market rate developers because they can't achieve the high rents they need to pay for the development costs. So this leaves many communities behind. Next slide, please. I will skip that slide. It's there in the book for your information. Moving on to the next slide. Seth?
So the problem that is affecting us in California in general is that with these high rents, people are having to make decisions for their personal health. Can they afford health care? Are they suffering mentally? Are they suffering physically? Commute times are affecting them. People who serve in communities might have to live an hour away. And then economically, this is affecting California because we're having a mass exodus. We have people moving to Idaho, Nevada, Texas, Florida, Colorado. My brother is a chef. He lost 5 people in his kitchen over the last 2 years because of COVID, and they just can't afford to live here anymore. And so this is affecting the communities where people serve. They can no longer live there, as several of the other speakers have talked about today. Next slide, please.
Won't go into this too much, but these are some examples of who the missing middle are. These are people who are core to our industry and our communities, and we need them. Next slide, please. This is a demonstration, essentially how housing is built, assuming you're at $500,000 a unit to build one apartment. And that's comprised of land, soft costs, hard costs, and fees. Those are really fixed, except for that top square on the left. That's a bucket that we can manipulate, the cost of permits and fees. And so affordable housing is financed with primarily tax credit, equity, and debt. And because the debt is only 30% in this instance, affordable housing developers can charge lower rents. But when the financing mechanism is higher debt and high equity returns, equity investors typically seek a 15 to 18% return on their investment, developers are forced to charge more rent. But that chasm between the high end of affordable and the low end of market is $500, $600, sometimes $1,000, forcing people to stay in the low income housing and creating a massive problem. Next slide, please. So how can a property tax abatement help California's workforce families? In the interest of time, and Mr. Young thoroughly covered this, I just want to stress that the Middlemarch Fund is something that is available as a...
I'm sorry, you said next slide.
Yes.
Next slide, please.
Thank you so much. I didn't catch that.
She went in the back. Yeah, we're having some difficulties there. Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
No, she's went in.
Okay. I lost the AT&T line.
Okay. Well,
Yes.
then we
We're
can...
having some technical difficulties. Would you mind holding for just 1 second?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Reconnect with AT&T.
It was our PowerPoint that was so powerful.
We never had technical difficulties. This is the first.
It's too much data.
Great slide presentation, by the way.
There we go.
Thank you.
you.
Terrific.
Just a minute, Mr. Ketty, are we able to?
Let me go check. Yeah, we're just trying to bridge in.
We lost our audio feed,
Our
so we need to
audio
make sure
feed,
for
so
the
we just
public
want to
that
make
they
sure
can
we've got
hear.
that, yeah.
Did we lose the 240 streamers?
I don't know. I don't know. That's pretty impressive.
This is an impressive presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
We can resume now. Thank you.
Perfect,
I
thank you.
appreciate the time.
A lot of words on this slide to essentially say that a public subsidy is required for a property tax abatement. So everything over 80% area median income, with some exceptions, doesn't get to benefit from a property tax abatement, which is an incredibly powerful tool. And without it, it leaves millions of Californians, in our belief, challenged for affordable housing. Next slide.
So, is it connecting?
Let's see, next slide, please.
Okay, so thank you. Why are property tax abatements useful, especially up to 120% of area median income versus the current 80%? So PTA would allow for rental income to be reduced due to the removal of property tax expenses, allowing for the net operating income to be achieved instead of charging outsized rents that they have to achieve with the luxury rental market. And so this would allow for moderate income units to be built in underserved communities that otherwise would not have received this investment. And so there would be a ripple effect where land that was underdeveloped would then be developed. Even with a 10-year property tax abatement, there would still be an increase in values due to the investment in the community. And so without options to finance middle-income housing, regional housing needs assessment goals cannot be met. For example, in San Diego, we had 3% of the necessary moderate income housing units built between 2013 and 2021. Next slide, please.
Yes, please ask a question. Senator Gaines.
Yeah, thank you, because I'm just trying to, we had this legislation that's moving through, Assembly Bill 1206, that would utilize the welfare exemption to lower income household occupants and increase it to 140% of area median income. Would this address the issue you're speaking of, or?
It would.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Is that the bill that correlated with the community land trust?
Yes.
I think it could help, but we need to do more research into it, because that would primarily be for purchases, or does it apply to rentals as well? That might be for another time.
I'm not sure.
I
thought,
Sounds like
thought
another
it
work
included
group
rental.
meeting.
It does include rental. Yes.
It is specifically rental.
Or
I don't think
specific.
it
Okay.
includes.
Okay.
Then yes,
Good.
it could help. But so this slide is just to give you an overview of how a property tax abatement directly drops the rent needed to make a development work. So assuming a basis of $450,000 per unit to build in San Diego, it could be higher. Using a property tax rate of 1.12%, that's an annual tax rate of $5,000 per unit, or $420 per month. The market rate for a one-bedroom right now in San Diego on average is $2,500. That can drastically drop the rent from $2,500 to $2,080, or a 20% decrease in the rent. And it's a bottom line drop, and it
Thank you.
directly helps out the renters. Next slide, please.
So allowing for multifamily properties that are privately financed to be eligible would be very beneficial to the renters directly. And on middle-income units, we're referring to units between 80 and 120% of the area median income. Also suggesting that there be a sunset provision or a time frame. This does not have to be a forever exemption. It could be for 10 years. It could be something that is for a period of time that weans off, and it will incentivize development, not just on that site, but catalyze communities where market rate housing can't right now be financed. Next slide.
No, wait.
Yeah.
Since you're here,
Yeah.
I'm just going to pepper you with questions.
Do it.
So going back to your first point, why is this not already being done, from your perspective? Privately financed. Why are not privately financed projects eligible? It's just the way the legislation is written.
To my knowledge, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Continue.
Next slide, please. So the Property tax abatement, as Seth pointed out, can lead to essentially a 20% rent reduction that gets passed directly to the families. What Middlemarch does is we add a deed restriction onto those units so that they stay between 80 and 120% area median income for 30 years. Some tool like that, and there are many other companies out there that are focusing on middle income, to be paired with this would work very, very well. Developers will earn the same return with this property tax abatement suggestion. It's a win-win. They don't benefit, the renter does. I mentioned the sunset provision, and what also happens is that now there's more private funding available for the creation of middle-income housing, and there are so many sites that could be perfect catalysts for this. And when Mr. Spears spoke earlier, there's competitiveness going after these tax credits and bonds. What if the developer doesn't get them? Sometimes it takes 2-3 years before they go back and get the application. This could immediately be built as middle-income housing. Next slide, please. We have this one for your information, and I'm not going to go into it because it's tiny text, but in Seattle, they did a program, and it has helped to create 32,000 middle-income housing units.
We heard from Seattle last month.
Yeah, very impressive.
Yes, it is.
And the last slide, in conclusion, we just want to say that without your consideration of a property tax abatement, California will continue to demonstrate a lack of action in the public-private sector. This state's leadership on this issue is crucial, and there are developers, lenders, and communities who are ready and willing to build middle-income housing in partnership with you. So please don't waste this opportunity to consider an opportunity for innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that strong call to action. Way to end your presentation, which actually leads me to my next question is what kind of advocacy are you engaging with members of the legislature? Do you participate in lobby days? Is there a coalition that will also amplify these suggestions?
There are many people who are engaged in the middle income fight,
Yes.
I will say. We do participate in lobby days. I will be stepping more into that in the coming years. The partnership with civic communities used to be Civic Center Development, which was the former redevelopment agency in San Diego. And I'm a member of the Building Industry Association on the board in San Diego, as well as some philanthropy on even homelessness with the Lucky Duck Foundation. So I advocate on all housing matters, from 0 up to 120% AMI, because we need all types of housing. Mr. Blackwell said it. We have to compromise. We have to find ways where we can work together, and what can we do? What can we do to innovate?
Absolutely. So I think that this conversation here is definitely timely, and I appreciate it. Let me see if there's members. Mr. Eppolite.
I was just going to ask the chair, could we also get a copy of this presentation?
Sure. For all presenters, we need to get copies so that we can take these conclusions and solutions to heart. And Mr. Eppolite just represents the controller, and as you know, the controller sits on CIDLAC and TCAC, so this is mutually beneficial, not just for us, but also for the controller's office. Mr. Vasquez, and then let me see, Mr. Gaines,
Just
Mr.
thank you
Schaefer.
very much. I really appreciate
Thank you.
the information. Very valuable.
Mr. Vasquez?
As I was listening, and you might have had it on one of the slides, but I didn't catch it, did you give a breakdown of what, because you're in the for-profit side, you're not on the nonprofit side, what it's costing per unit, roughly?
Yeah, and we use a metric in San Diego County, for example, about $500,000 to build one apartment. It can go as high as $1 million in the Bay Area.
I know.
Thank you. Anyone on my left? Mr. Schaefer?
Deborah, I was very impressed with what you brought to us today, and thank both of you for coming. We don't see people from San Diego that often. Do you have an opportunity to talk with the media in San Diego, talk with leading civic clubs like Leading Rotary, Kiwanis, of that nature? I think they would enjoy hearing from you. I've been to them and seen some very great programs, and this is something that San Diego needs to know about, and I'd write a letter to the editor, but it'd be better if you'd write an op-ed.
Will you co-write it with me?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
So keep your eyes on this board. We're going to be moving with urgency, and it's almost like this conversation is just will help us zero in with laser focus on where we need to insert our voice. So let me see if Mr. Gaines has anything. If not, we'll hear. Yep, we'll hear from the next presenters. Thank you
Very much.
Thank you.
The next presenters are the Spur Panel, William A. Witt, Chairman and CEO, Related California, Michael E. Johnson, President and CEO of Urban Core Development, and V. Fee Sen, Founder, Managing Partner from Windflower Properties. I believe most of them are virtual. Mr. Witt is, we have confirmed him. See if we have the others.
Bill Whitty, are you on? Face in, is that you that I see?
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
good.
hello.
Hello. Good to see you. We're going to look for two of our other panelists. We've got Michael E. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, are you on? Okay. Well, when they join us, we'll find them and we'll add them. Ms. Sien, why don't you go ahead and begin? Welcome. Thank you for coming to present to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so appreciative that this committee is looking at this very important tool that we need in order to develop housing. Madam Chair and members of the board, I am Fei Sen, President of Windflower Properties. Windflower Properties is a mission-driven development company which I formed a decade ago, primarily to build projects that would be a model for other communities. And I have been fortunate to have the opportunity in the last 4 decades to have a roles in the nonprofit, the public, and the private sectors, and to work on housing developments and policies that have made an impact in the Bay Area. This committee is looking at ways in which property tax abatement can be a tool to spur more construction of middle-income housing. I would like to give the example of a project that I built, which was finished at the end of 2018, and a project that we have on the boards right now. Both are in Union City, and there's dramatic differences in the costs that we face now versus when we built that first project about 3 years ago. And what I would like to do is to start my slides and share that, and let me know if you...
Excuse me, I think we're having some difficulty about you sharing slides at the moment.
I see.
Mm-hmm. If you could present without your slides and you could submit them in to us later, we could share
I
them.
see. Okay, well, I'm sorry that we don't have the images, because the images really show how important this type of housing is, and that it's not just about housing, it is about building a neighborhood and a community. And much of what Windflower creates is actually about neighborhoods that are vibrant, has a mix of uses that are walkable, bikeable, and accessible by public transit. So I start with the story of a small progressive city that transformed a brownfield into a new walkable residential community next to the BOT station. The city is Union City in mid-Alameda County next to Fremont. This is, and I have a picture which shows the defunct Pacific Steel facility and a PG&E pipe yard right next to the Union City BOT station. Union City, when there was a redevelopment agency, leveraged the redevelopment funds and state grants to mediate the land and put in new roads and infrastructure. And that set the possibility for a private developer like myself to come and build a new residential community here. So Windflower was chosen by the city as a master residential developer, and it is transforming the area with a high standard of design, creating a walkable, bikeable, sustainable district with a choice of housing options. One of the photos that I show shows a whole range of affordability. Next to the market rate project is the 157 units of very low income to moderate income housing, which was done in conjunction with nonprofit Mid-Penn Housing. But next to it is the Windflower market rate housing, where the rents are affordable to middle income households making less than 120% of median income. And who are the middle income tenants that we are housing? Exactly the demographic that we expected when we designed and built the project. There are young professionals starting out as low-level employees of tech firms, of biotechnology firms, who are in the health industries. They work for Facebook, Meta, Tesla. They are nurses and health workers as well. It's exactly the demographic that needs this middle-income housing that is affordable still to those who make 100 to 120% of median income. So how do we achieve this when construction costs are spiraling out of sight? And our company actually pays a lot of attention to lowering the cost of construction by very efficient design. So one way of doing it is certainly by using good design methods and being very careful about what the costs are. But despite all the attention to construction costs, they have been spiraling out of sight. And as an example, our next project, which is 443 units in the 3.5 acre site adjacent to this first project that we built, the construction costs have spiraled out of control. And so 443 units that has been entitled is ready to start construction. Our construction costs have come in, and in fact, we cannot make this project work today. So a tool like the property tax abatement is very important to us, because what it does, it reduces the operating costs in the initial years so that we are able actually to finance more of the project. It's an important way that would have an immediate impact on the feasibility of these projects. You have heard from other cities of what they've done in New York, Seattle, Chicago, Washington State, to name a few. But you know, every project that we do, we have to go through an exhausting marathon of value engineering and keeping costs in check while construction prices are soaring. We need to search for equity that is willing to invest in middle-income housing quickly and early in the development process. We need grants to support transit-oriented developments, like the state IIG and TOD grants from Proposition 1C that no longer support this type of middle-income housing. We need to lower impact fees that local governments charge for new family housing construction. But in the Bay Area, where the construction costs are absolutely out of control. You know, San Francisco, the construction costs are now the highest in the world. And then coupled from the disruption from the pandemic, there is no workforce housing that is being started. We have subsidized low-income housing that has local, state, and federal subsidies, and we have very high luxury condos that are being built, but nothing in between for working families. There was a crisis of affordability prior to the pandemic, and as we emerge, there will continue to be insufficient housing to house the middle. If the private market does not produce enough housing for average working families, it will have an impact on the functioning and equity of our regional economy and our state economy. But I really appreciate that your committee is investigating this topic. This tool is so important to make possible the construction of projects such as mine. And I thank you for that, and I'm willing to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We have worked out our technical difficulties on our end, so presenters will be able to present their shared slides.
I am so sorry, because part of my wanting to show you the projects that we have built is that these are properties which are, in fact, making vibrant spaces in where it used to be industrial land. We're making into much more productive uses. And I'm sorry that you were not able to see the slides that I had.
Perhaps you'd be willing to email our office. I can be your service, your point of contact, and we can disseminate your slides not only to the colleagues on this body, but also post it to the BOE website so the members of the public can also receive the information so that everyone has access. And this goes for all the presenters that are going to be presenting today. With that said, I'm told that we've got our two presenters in the waiting room. We've got Mr. Whitty and Mr. Johnson in the waiting room. Does that sound right online? Do you see them? And Faye, how do you pronounce your last name? Sen?
Sen.
Thank
Faye
you.
Sen.
Thank you very much for your perspective. This was important, and we look forward to receiving your emailed slides. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to another speaker. Ask AT&T. I'm asking AT&T if they have any of our speakers in queue.
AT&T moderators, or anyone on the line who would like to make a public comment regarding this item?
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, for public comment, please press 10 at this time.
I'm told Mr. Johnson and Mr. Whitty are on the AT&T line.
Okay, let's see if they'll come in.
Okay. Yeah, well, we got one coming in. One moment while we identify which one that is.
Just going to check to see.
So we're juggling multiple things. We have people in person, we have people online, and we have people calling in. This is the modern day presentation.
Okay, currently in queue, we have Mr. Michael Johnson. Your line's open. Go ahead, please.
All right, great. Let's get Mr. Johnson online. Mr. Johnson, good to see you or hear from you. Mr. Johnson is the CEO and president of Urban Core Development. Mr. Johnson, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. It's Malia Cohen. Good afternoon.
Yes, hello. How are you?
Good.
Malia, I hope it's okay. Can I address you as Malia? We've known each other quite a while.
We have.
Anyway, good afternoon. I guess it's good morning to members of the Board of Equalization. As was mentioned, my name is Michael Johnson. I'm a developer based in Oakland. I have been in the development business in the Bay Area for over 30 years. I have been working with Michael Lane and other members of this, our sort of ad hoc working group, trying to promote the development of more mixed income housing throughout the Bay Area. I want to preface my brief remarks by saying, my experience in California and in the Bay Area regarding the process of getting entitlements is that inclusionary zoning is something that is very important. It is a political issue that is very important in all communities, and I think the result of it is more inclusionary communities that we should be building. A part of that whole effort is the challenge around financing those transactions. I would like to highlight briefly that we completed a mixed income project at the Coliseum BART station, which was one of the few mixed income transactions done in East Oakland, where we had 50% of the units that were affordable tax credit units at 50 and 60% of AMI and 50% that were market rate. And in doing so, we created a mixed-in community that is very vibrant, but it wasn't without challenges, and it was only because of the participation by both the state, the city of Oakland, and Alameda County that we were able to pull together the necessary financing in order to make that project work. However, that type of transaction is not repetitive. BART would like us to do additional development at that station, but it would only come about as a result of higher density and the additional financing tools that are being discussed by this work group, specifically having the ability to have tax exemption on moderate income units within the project, because that has been an impediment. That whole missing middle section of our community is one where we are not able to find financing tools. And so what's being discussed here that would become a part of the budget is very critical to trying to move those projects forward. So I urge the committee to proceed with considering these types of alternatives, and it will result in more mixed income housing, particularly in some of our low and moderate income communities and high cost areas like the Bay Area. Thank you for the time to speak with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate your presentation, and I'm going to bring in Mr. Bill Whitty, who is going to be coming in online. Mr. Whitty, we see you on screen. Thank you for taking time to be with us. So, gentlemen, what I'd like to do is we'll hear from Mr. Whitty, and then we will have our questions for you both. So, Mr. Johnson, stay on the line so we can answer questions, and if Ms. Sien is still on, we can pose all of our questions collectively to this panel. Mr. Whitty, are you ready to present?
I am.
Good.
And thank you very much for even holding this hearing. It's a complicated topic, but I think a very timely one, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but not for lack of interest. Just very briefly, let me say, I'm the chairman and CEO of Related California. We have offices in Irvine, LA, and San Francisco. We are one of the more active developers in the state of 100% affordable housing, but we are also, which I think is particularly relevant today, the most active developer of mixed income housing. So we have a very, I think, detailed perspective on this question, particularly the economics of it. I would say that right now, and you've probably heard this, there's sort of a dual problem. First of all, because of increasing construction costs, which I will give some detail on, as well as an increase in interest rates, there's just an infeasibility problem across housing that isn't just completely subsidized. There is at the same time, understandably, a desire for more affordable housing. And mixed income housing has long been a tool in the tool shed that we have exploited to do that. And I want to emphasize that for us, we have 20% low-income units in some of the most expensive projects in the state. Mixing incomes is not an issue. Don't let anybody tell you that it is. It's not an inhibition to renting high-end market rate units. In fact, in the most expensive areas, it's a very useful tool and it works very well. We have over 2,000 units of that in San Francisco alone. And many more in LA and some in the works. So if you look at those problems together, what can the government do to help? Well, there's a lot of talk and legislation now about expediting processing. That's great, but that's not going to move the needle significantly on cost. I mean, it's worth doing, but it's not going to change this equation very much. Then there's direct subsidies, which are typically applied local and state to 100% affordable projects. And there's a lot of activity in that realm. But as you're hearing, it's in this arena of either trying to apply inclusionary housing affordability requirements to market rate projects to generate additional affordable housing, or simply, as Michael Johnson, I heard say, talking about reaching the missing middle, an area that's at least in the high cost area is not being served at all. Let me give you a project we're working on in San Francisco now as a good example of this. This project is at 98 Franklin Street in the Hayes Valley neighborhood of the city, fully entitled, ready to start within the next several months. We agreed before COVID to 25% affordability, 20% low and 5%, 100% of median. Pretty significant. This is 3 blocks from a very successful 550-unit high-rise that's 20% low income that we completed 3 years ago at Mission and South Van Ness. The construction costs for very similar projects, the 35-story building, are 40% higher today than they were 4 years ago. 40%. They're over $500 a gross square foot. And rents, we're doing fine. And of course, Malia, you're well aware of our Potrero Hill project, which is also 20% low income. But you can't make up for that type of a cost hit. You can't just keep pretending that rents are going to keep escalating into the sky. So based on the experience that we've seen in some of our other affiliates in Illinois and New York and other places, in Oregon, as I think you've heard, there's a lot of examples of cities and states even using property taxes to help generate not just housing, but mixed income housing. And here, since it's not, frankly, politically tenable, as those states have done, to have a waiver of taxes, we have been in discussions with Spur and others about a reimbursement of taxes over a 10-year period. Now, in the 98 Franklin example, where right now the returns to investors to get this financed and built are well below market, and I think you know we're a pretty ambitious developer. We just opened the Grand Avenue project with Frank Gehry in LA that's 20% low income also. So we're not afraid of complicated projects. But right now, it doesn't make economic sense. If this project were to get a 10-year reimbursement, property taxes are about $2.4 million a year. So over 10 years, that's 25, 26, 27 million. This is just hypothetical. We're not saying this is the proposal on the table. Now, that's 325 units, of which almost 90 are affordable. So if you took those units and just say all you're really doing is getting 90 affordable units, let alone the other 250 or so of additional needed housing that the city and others need, that's about 300,000 a unit just per affordable unit. Well, in San Francisco today, 100% affordable unit requires like 500,000 a unit or more in subsidy. So while that's hardly a small number, it is relatively efficient way not only to get more affordable housing, but to get more market rate housing in general and in a mixed income setting. So I think it's worth thinking about it in that context. Now, the same cost increases have occurred up and down the state. So while San Francisco, as you've probably read, is now the most expensive city in the world to build, LA and San Diego, where we also have projects, have experienced the same challenge. And we are eager to continue doing mixed income housing. So now, what would you have to do in such a program to be eligible for it? I mean, being realistic, this can't just be easy for anyone. We're asking for almost a pilot program type approach here. I'm assuming that there would have to be at least 15% or more affordability to be eligible. We're assuming that there'd be payment of prevailing wages on construction. And there'd have to be a market determination that you really needed it. I mean, California Housing Finance Agency is equipped to administer a program like this, so that certainly could be considered. So I'm just proposing this at a kind of a very high level today because I appreciate your involvement in this. And again, I want to emphasize to us, this is just economics. It's not a concern about mixing lower income or moderate income housing in a market rate project. We do it all the time. So I thank you for that opportunity and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whitty. Hold on. Let me just double check with my team here. Ms. Cicchetti, if I'm not mistaken, are we taking questions?
Questions for the panel right now.
Right now, okay. All right,
Yes.
thank you. All right, so these are questions that if Mr. Spear is on, Ms. Norwood, Ruane, if she's still here, just making sure that you're still available to answer questions, Mr. Whitty, Mr. Johnson, Ms. Sen. And I think we will hear from Mark Stivers and Shelley Scott after lunch.
Yes, they're
Okay,
scheduled
great.
for after lunch.
All right, look, we've got everybody on. Okay, colleagues, fire them away. Go ahead. Vasquez.
Yes. This is a question for Bill. Thanks for coming on, Bill. I know you've done some great things, especially in Santa Monica, where you're talking about high-end, mixing it in with low-income, affordable units. And I was just more interested in your ideas and suggestions as we're talking about the economics of it and what maybe the state can do from your experience to, one, reduce the costs and hopefully expedite the process, because I know for a lot of the nonprofits and for-profits, time is money, and if it's taken 2 to 3 years to get your entitlements and get all your tax credits, package everything together, that's a waste of money.
Well, thank you for that. As you know, in Santa Monica, the different ways to do mixed income. Our older project, very successful, was 158 luxury condos and 160 low-income tax credit financed units side by side. And the money we paid to the city for the condos was used to help subsidize the affordable. But if we're talking, as we are today, I think about within a building, we have a current project in Santa Monica, 275 units of which replacing a Vons supermarket. You build on top of it, of which 30% would be affordable. That was plausible because the rents in Santa Monica are higher than any place in California in an urban setting. So there's room to internally subsidize. But now you have the uptick in financing costs and construction costs, and ambitions like that are no longer feasible. The advantage of a program like we're discussing today, whether it be used for missing middle and or mixed income, is that, to your point, it could be done more quickly. It wouldn't require 7 subsidy sources. It wouldn't require, dealing with 3 state agencies. It would require resources. But as I said earlier, I think one could argue it's an efficient use of resources. So as we continue to fret about the inability to serve these populations, this would be a very efficient way to do it, particularly in the highest cost areas where the affordability gap is the greatest.
Thank you. Any other
Perhaps
questions?
if I can add to
Yes, please, go ahead.
Bill's statement, because I think it's a really important one. We are, a traditional affordable housing developer. We primarily serve folks at 60% of area or less in each of our communities. But we're also recognizing that the narrowing of the resources available for that development and the competition has created sort of a race to the bottom in terms of the affordability. That then creates a challenge for us to really try to address the needs on the moderate side of the spectrum. We were the first nonprofit to take advantage of the California Housing Finance Agency's mixed income program. And we're on our second deal that we just broke ground on in National City. Being able to mix in a higher level of income level of units really gets us the opportunity to serve the more broader needs in our communities. And if there was additional resources and, really frankly from, they would come out of your leadership in terms of expanding the range for the welfare tax exemption, that would allow developers like us and like Bill and Michael Johnson and others to really be able to move forward on those types of transactions which are wholly needed. I would also say very quickly, this is also the opportunity to have an anti-gentrification measure. If you get the opportunity to, whether it's building new units or purchasing existing unrestricted properties and then bringing affordability restrictions to those, that then locks in some affordable units in communities, and particularly those that may be facing gentrification pressures and highly accelerating rents. It's a means to make sure that the people that live in those neighborhoods get to stay in those neighborhoods. And I think that would be an added benefit to what you were thinking about here.
All right. Mr. Eppolite, nothing? Colleagues, Mr. Gaines.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you all for your presentations, but I had a question for Mr. Bill Whitty, if you could help me with this, with the mixed income. Are you saying that you simply can't build them now because of these increased costs?
Well, as some of my colleagues on this call have said, right now, even if there weren't a mix of incomes, it's difficult to build because of cost. But I'm saying there's a political reality that mixed income is highly desirable, often required in high-income areas. And the reality is that most of these projects, and I'm not saying these are bad, but they carry a host of public policy objectives, labor standards, mix of incomes, local hiring, things like that. Those are all good things. But in a time of record high costs, yes, I'm saying it's no longer feasible. Sean makes an interesting point, because I'm talking about sort of luxury projects that in fact could help combat anti-gentrification arguments as well. Sean's talking about affordable projects that are coming at it on the high end. Both are achieving a similar goal, a different type of project. I think that's important, because it isn't just one minor category of projects. They're different. It gives local governments the flexibility to tailor this to whatever their particular policy priority is, but all aimed at mixed income. And again, the mix of income things is just a loss of income in the economics. As I said, it works socially, but when you have record high costs and you can barely pencil projects where you get free land and have no affordability, then to add a mix of incomes on it, which everybody thinks is desirable, becomes very challenging.
Yeah, thank you very much. And would the other panelists like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, this is Michael Johnson. I just want to weigh in with a couple more comments. Sean was talking about, affordable projects, which his company does as primarily as a nonprofit. Clearly related is building at the high end of the market with a mix of affordability. And our company, Urban Core Development, in addition to being a Black development company, our focus has been in transitional communities, which are usually minority, that are surrounding most of the urban areas. And in those locations, what we're trying to do is not just build 100% affordable. The market doesn't support, high-end mixed income. So we're really ending up with what is a term that many people have been using for years, which is workforce housing, which is synonymous now with the missing middle. And so we're really talking about projects that have the high end of the programming as 100 to 120% of AMI, and then the mixed income component that might represent anywhere from 15 to 30% of the units that are tax credit units that are, in the 50% range. So if you do like a 60-40 bond transaction, and in that situation, there's not funding available for the higher portion of the project, the 100 to 120%. And so that's where this type of property tax refund program would help in getting those units financed within a project, in addition to the tax credits that would support, the level of income that's below 60%. Even in this type of transaction, we will still need to apply to the state or the city or the county for other levels of subsidy, but being able to have property tax relief on the upper portion of this mixed income project, is critical. We didn't have that relief in our Coliseum project. We actually pay 50% of the property taxes on the units that are not tax credit, and most of those units have families in them that have incomes between 80 and 120%. But what I'm speaking to is the need going forward to be able to create this tool in order to continue to do those types of projects. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, folks. We are going to pivot to take public comment. We're going to check the line. Please hold.
Yes. AT&T moderator, please check the line to see if there's anyone who would like to make a public comment regarding these items.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen on the phone lines, if you'd like to make public comment, please press 1 followed by 0 at this time. 1 followed by 0. And we are having no participants queue up at this time.
Okay, Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I was not muted. I was muted, so could not make my comment. May I make a comment now?
Oh, yes, please. Yes, let's get your voice.
Yes, thank you. I think that if I could say, Windflower Properties in this latest project, although we've done many affordable housing projects, it's a market rate development, 100% market rate, because we built the affordable housing first in the first phase. So this phase, the next 2 phases, are market rate. And if we are going to have for production of units, to have the private market do that without public subsidy, it's so important with these construction costs. Just a little relief in the property taxes makes such a difference in the operating expenses, so that these projects without public subsidy can go forward. And what you want to do is incentivize private developers like myself to be able to build more for this middle income group. So I would say that if you can do a pilot project, which allows for property tax abatement for projects that are transit oriented, that are sustainable, that are innovative, I think that it would allow private developers to do something at a time when actually no other developments are actually going forward without public subsidies. So, thank you.
Thank you for lending your voice. Wanted to see if Ms. Ruane had any comments.
No, I just agree with that comment so completely.
Okay.
We have to enable the developers to develop. We need housing. We need to get out of their way and let them do it.
With that said, let me ask a question to all of the developers. Recently has come to my attention that there's a shrinking pool of insurers to insure your projects, and these are your affordable housing projects. Maybe you can describe to me some of the challenges, if at all, that you're seeing. Does that sound familiar, insurers?
I defer to Mr. Spears or one of the other active developers on that.
Okay, so one of the other active developers, we've got Mr. Spears, we've got Mr. Johnson and Mr. Whitty. We've got Ms. Sien. If you guys would like to comment, please do so.
I would say, the project that we did, the first project that we did, actually we used innovation, we used modular technology. And it was a way to decrease the cost of construction, to build those units off-site and then bring them to the site when they were ready. And there is right now a problem with insurance for the modular industry, and that is something that I would look into.
Yeah, I would add just very quickly, I think this is definitely a major concern, not only for new development and the assumptions we have to make around where insurance is going, but also for our existing portfolios. And what we ended up having to do was really develop a fine-tuned model for reviewing insurance. We have traditionally had a blanket policy for our entire portfolio with an insurance provider, but in essence, we had to break that up because not only is there just a general overall increase in insurance, there's also much higher rates in certain areas of the state, particularly areas that are deemed in the fire zones. So that has forced us to have a more nuanced approach to insurance and really doing a lot more of shopping in order to find insurance that still stays within what we originally assumed for the operation of the properties.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's some of the things that I'm hearing from conversations that I'm having within the affordable housing and the development community across the entire state, is that not only are we dealing with, we as a Board of Equalization are focused on tax abatement, using that to stimulate development, but also realizing that we're working in an environment where it's becoming just increasingly difficult to produce. When I say difficult, I mean affordable, making it it's very difficult to create affordable housing to bring to the marketplace, because the environment that you're doing business is incredibly expensive, and somebody's got to foot the cost.
Yeah.
So thank you. We're going to have to keep moving forward. I appreciate your conversation. We've got no more public comment. So, Mr. Ketty, what's next on the agenda?
We have a lunch break.
A lunch break. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for your time. We are going to take a 45-minute lunch break. Therefore, we will be reconvening at 1:15 this afternoon. Thank you. We are in recess.
Thank you.
All right. Ahead. you.